The boarding and the Walter Airport was alive with the sound of rushing footsteps, rolling suitcases, and constant announcements echoing through the halls. The evening light outside filtered through the tall glass windows, casting a golden glow over the wide lobby and the people moving about with a mix of excitement and fatigue. Among them walked a tall black man in a navy blue jacket and simple jeans, carrying himself with the calm confidence of someone who had long ago learned patience. His name was Marcus, and though no one around him knew it, he was a decorated pilot with thousands of flight hours under his belt. He had flown through storms that rattled even the strongest hearts. He had guided planes through the darkest skies, and had saved lives more times than most would ever know. Yet today he was not in uniform. He was traveling home from a rare personal trip, and his ticket placed him in first class. Marcus walked to the gate where passengers were already lined up. The line moved slowly as the airline staff scanned boarding passes. He waited quietly, not drawing attention to himself, and when his turn came, he smiled politely and offered his ticket. The gate agent scanned it and gave a quick nod, sending him toward the plane. The air smelled faintly of coffee and perfume as Marcus stepped onto the jet bridge and moved toward the doorway of the aircraft inside the plane. The cabin crew stood greeting passengers with practiced smiles. A young stewardess with perfectly styled hair and sharp eyes caught sight of him as he handed over his boarding pass. Again her eyes flicked from the ticket to Marcus, then back again. Her smile faltered just slightly, as if something in her mind did not align with the paper in her hand. She hesitated and then gestured toward the aisle, but when Marcus stepped forward, she spoke, her voice a little louder than needed. "Sir, I think you are in the wrong section. Your seat is not here." Marcus stopped looking at her. Calmly, he had been here before, not on this exact plane, not in this exact moment, but in countless small ways through life. He knew that look of disbelief, the tone that carried both suspicion and dismissal. He replied with quiet certainty, "My ticket says first class." The stewardess looked at the ticket again, then back at him. Her brow creased, her lips tightened as if the paper itself could not be trusted. "Sir, maybe you should double-check economy," she said firmly. "It must be some mistake." The passengers behind Marcus began to shift uneasily, some peering over his shoulder at the exchange. A couple in business attire frowned as if wondering why the process was delayed. A young boy clutching a toy airplane stared, wide-eyed, at Marcus as though sensing the tension. His mother gently pulled him closer, whispering for him to look away. Marcus stood his ground, his tall frame steady and unmoved. His voice remained calm but stronger this time. "There is no mistake. This is my seat." The stewardess pursed her lips, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. She leaned slightly to the side, signaling to another crew member nearby, and whispered something quickly. The second stewardess glanced at Marcus, then back at her colleague, and shrugged uncertainly. But the first stewardess pressed on. She raised her voice enough for those in the cabin to hear. "Sir, this section is reserved for our premium passengers. Please step aside so others can board." The words struck like cold steel, cutting through the air. Premium passengers, the implication hung there unspoken, but heavy enough for everyone to feel. Marcus felt the heat rising in his chest, but his face remained composed. The insult was not new yet. The sting never dulled. He looked directly into her eyes, not with anger but with a calm that unsettled her. Even more behind him, murmurs began to rise. "What is going on? Why won't they let him sit? He has a ticket, doesn't he?" Someone whispered, "Maybe he is trying to sneak into first class." Another voice countered sharply, "No, look at him. He is carrying himself like he belongs there." The passengers divided in their silent judgments, some siding with the stewardess, others quietly defending Marcus, but all waiting to see what would unfold. Took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch around him. He could feel every gaze pressing on his back, every judgment forming without knowing who he was, what he had done, and what he deserved. The stewardess still blocked his path, her arms slightly spread as if guarding the empty seat, waiting just beyond her. He did not argue further. Instead, he stood tall and unyielding, letting his presence speak louder than words. The tension thickened as the line of passengers behind him grew restless. A businessman huffed impatiently, tapping his foot, while a young woman shook her head, whispering that this was ridiculous. Still no one dared to step forward. The stewardess finally crossed her arms, her voice sharper now. "Sir, I am asking you to please step aside or I will have to call security." Her tone carried authority, but beneath it trembled a hint of unease, as though she felt the weight of the eyes around her. As well, Marcus met her stare, his silence stronger than any protest, his calmness unnerved her more than anger ever could. He knew that if he exploded in rage, he would only feed into the story she wanted to believe, but his quiet resistance was something she could not easily dismiss. Hush spread through the first-class cabin. As other seated passengers watched curiously, a man in a tailored suit lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowing. A woman with sparkling jewelry leaned forward, intrigued by the unfolding drama. Even the children sensed the shift, holding on to their parents with quiet curiosity. The entire plane seemed to pause, holding its breath as the moment stretched longer inside. Marcus, a storm brewed memories of training nights of exhaustion, years of discipline, and moments of saving countless lives surged. Through him he had earned respect in cockpits around the world, yet here he stood, doubted by a stewardess who saw only his skin and his clothes. The humiliation was sharp, but his dignity was sharper. He would not let it be taken from him. The stewardess glanced back at her fellow crew as if seeking reassurance, but none came. The second stewardess shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether this confrontation was worth it. The captain had not yet arrived at the front, and the other crew members were busy managing boarding. The responsibility weighed on her, and yet she pushed forward, unwilling to bend. "Sir, this is your last chance," she declared, her words ringing out across the cabin. Marcus inhaled deeply and remained still. He knew something that she did not know, and that knowledge gave him strength. The silence from him felt heavy, deliberate, like a warning bell no one else could hear. Passengers leaned closer, eyes darting between the man who refused to move and the stewardess who refused to yield. The air grew hotter with each passing second. The whispers intensified. A man muttered, "Just let him sit for crying." Out loud, a woman whispered, "Maybe he cannot afford it. Maybe it is fake." Another responded, "No, look at his eyes, he knows something." Marcus stood in the aisle, his ticket still in hand, the insult pressing hard against his pride, yet his resolve unshaken. The stewardess waited, her face stern, but the faint tremor of uncertainty in her hands betrayed her. A choice hung in the air, like a blade, suspended, ready to fall. The scene had begun with a simple ticket, but it had turned into something heavier, something that carried history, pain, and defiance within it. As the last of the passengers filed in, the jet bridge door closed and the hum of the engines became more pronounced. The stewardess shifted her weight, clearly unsettled but unwilling to show it. Marcus knew this was only the beginning, and he could feel the moment building like thunderclouds gathering over the horizon. The insult had been delivered, but his response, his truth, and his dignity were still waiting to be revealed. And with that, the stage was set for what was to come. The entire cabin caught in a silence, more powerful than any announcement, more gripping than any turbulence. The boarding had ended, but the real journey had only just begun. Whispers in the cabin. The tension hung heavy in the air as Marcus stood frozen in the aisle, his ticket still in his hand, while the stewardess kept her firm stance in front of him. The passengers continued to file past, squeezing into their seats with eyes darting back to the confrontation every chance they got. Whispers began to ripple like soft waves across the cabin, growing louder with each passing second. The whispers carried suspicion, curiosity, judgment, and even quiet support, but every word added weight to the already suffocating silence. A woman in the front row leaned toward her husband and whispered, "I told you something like this would happen. He does not look like a first-class passenger." Her husband shrugged nervously, not wanting to be involved, but his eyes lingered on Marcus with uncertainty. Across the aisle, a young college student pulled out her phone, tilting it ever so slightly to capture a video, her eyes wide with both fear and fascination. She whispered to her friend, "This could go viral. Imagine if he makes a scene." Her friend shushed her but kept watching closely. Marcus could hear fragments of the murmurs behind him, and though he had faced prejudice many times before, there was something about this moment that struck deeper. Maybe it was the way the stewardess raised her chin with certainty, as if her judgment was absolute. Maybe it was the quiet, the agreement of some passengers who were too ready to assume he did not belong. Or maybe it was the way children stared with confusion, wondering why the man with kind eyes was being treated as though he were an intruder. The whispers grew stronger, and the emotions in the cabin shifted like a storm gathering strength. One voice near the back muttered, "This is ridiculous. He has a ticket. Just let him sit already." Another countered, "But what if it is fake? You never know these days." A third voice whispered, "He looks like he knows exactly what he is doing. Maybe he really belongs there." The division spread through the cabin, creating invisible lines between passengers who saw dignity in Marcus and others who saw only doubt. Marcus stood tall, absorbing every word, letting it fuel the fire inside him, but outwardly he remained silent. His silence itself became a presence, that filled the cabin and unsettled those who had already judged him wrongly. The stewardess, on the other hand, felt her confidence faltering as the weight of so many watching eyes pressed against her. She tried to hold her ground, repeating the same words in her mind. This section is reserved. This is her duty. This is the rule. Yet even she could not ignore the shifting tide of voices in the second row. A man in a business suit lowered his glasses and spoke just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. I have been flying this airline for 20 years, and I know the look of a man who has earned his place. That man has the eyes of someone who has seen more than most of us combined. He belongs here more than anyone else. His words carried a conviction that spread to the people around him, softening some of the doubt. The stewardess heard it too, and for the first time her expression cracked, showing a flicker of hesitation. Still she pressed forward, determined to finish what she had started. She stepped closer to Marcus, lowering her voice, though it still carried across the tense silence. Sir, please do not make this more difficult than it has to be. You are delaying the boarding and causing discomfort for our passengers. Marcus did not move. He simply stared at her with steady eyes. His silence felt louder than any argument could have been. It unsettled her because she could not read his thoughts, and in that unreadable calm she felt her authority slipping. The whispers turned to quiet conversations as passengers leaned toward each other, debating the situation. Some said the stewardess was only doing her job. Others said she had gone too far. A woman with tired eyes holding a baby close muttered under her breath, "My husband works harder than anyone, and he never gets treated like this. One day people will realize how unfair it is." An older gentleman near the window folded his arms and said, "Let the man sit. We are not blind. We see what is happening." The cabin became a theater of murmurs, every seat another audience member with their own script of judgment. The sound of luggage thumping into overhead bins and seatbelts clicking into place faded behind the chorus of speculation. Every eye returned to Marcus and the stewardess, the center of a drama that had become larger than either of them. Marcus could feel the tide turning, but he knew it was not yet time to reveal his truth. He let the silence stretch, letting them all stew in their own assumptions. Finally, one of the passengers, a the aged woman with glasses, stood up from her seat. She spoke with surprising firmness, directed at the stewardess. "He has a ticket, does he not? Then let him sit. You are humiliating him in front of everyone." The cabin fell into another hush as her words cut through the noise. The stewardess froze, clearly caught between her pride and the growing discontent among passengers. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, Marcus gently raised a hand, silencing the woman who had spoken for him. He did not want anyone else to fight this battle on his behalf. Not yet. His calmness only deepened the mystery. Who was this man who stood so still, so composed under insult and scrutiny? Why did he not raise his voice, or argue like most would? What gave him such confidence? The whispers took on a new tone, now filled not just with suspicion or judgment, but with curiosity. People wanted to know his secret. The engines outside rumbled softly as the plane prepared for departure. The crew exchanged glances, uncertain whether to escalate the situation or wait for the captain to arrive. The stewardess shifted her stance, visibly unsettled, but still unwilling to step aside. Marcus looked around at the cabin, his eyes sweeping over faces young and old, each one waiting, each one holding breath for what would happen next. He could feel it in the air like static before lightning. The whispers had become a storm. The passengers caught between doubt and respect. The stewardess trapped between pride and fear, and himself standing as the unshaken center of it all. His time to speak would come soon, but not yet. For now, the whispers told the story better than he ever could, and each passing second drew every heart deeper into the mystery. The rising storm. The plane had finished boarding, yet no one seemed ready to settle down because all eyes remained locked on the silent man in the aisle and the stewardess blocking his way. The whispers of parting passengers had turned into a constant buzz, filling every corner of the cabin like the hum of an approaching storm. The stewardess adjusted her uniform, tugging at the sleeves as though tidying herself might give her back the control that was slipping through her fingers. Her eyes darted around the cabin, aware of the passengers who were staring and judging, but she refused to yield. Her training told her to protect the airline rules, and her pride told her to stand firm, but deep inside she could feel doubt crawling across her nerves. Stood calm and steady, though his chest carried the weight of humiliation and the echoes of prejudice he had endured before. This moment was different, because now he was not alone in some quiet street or in an office where he could be ignored. He was standing before an entire cabin filled with witnesses, every one of them watching, every one of them weighing his worth with their eyes. He felt the burden, but he also knew it was an opportunity to show strength, not just for himself, but for something larger than himself. The storm began to rise when a man in the back row stood up, frustration written all over his face. He raised his voice over the constant murmurs and said loudly enough, "Already he has a ticket. I saw it with my own eyes. Why are you wasting everyone's time?" His words carried across the cabin, drawing murmurs of agreement and nods from several passengers. The stewardess stiffened her shoulders and called back firmly, "Sir, please sit down. We will handle this." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the strain, but she held her ground. The man in the back sat, but the fire had already spread. His boldness gave courage to others, and soon more passengers began voicing their frustration. A woman with a baby shook her head and muttered to no one in particular, "This is shameful. We are going to sit through an entire flight remembering how they treated him." A young student near the front leaned across the aisle and whispered to another passenger, "Do you think he is somebody important? Maybe that is why he is so calm." The speculation fueled curiosity until the entire cabin buzzed with theories, each voice adding thunder to the gathering storm. The stewardess felt the walls closing in, yet she pressed forward. She reached for the small radio clipped to her belt, threatening quietly to call security before takeoff. But Marcus did not flinch. He remained steady, his hand resting lightly on the back of a nearby seat, his posture commanding. Without being forceful, his silence was more powerful than anger, and the stewardess could not understand why. That mystery unsettled her more than anything else. Suddenly, the second stewardess, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. She spoke softly, but her words carried to the front rows. "Maybe we should double-check with the captain. He looks like he knows what he is doing." The first stewardess snapped back with quiet sharpness, "No rules are rules. If we bend them now, what message does that send?" Her tone dripped with pride, but even she felt the current shifting against her. Marcus remained still, but inside memories flooded him of nights in cockpits where alarms blared and storms raged, where lives hung by the thread of his calm decisions. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the silence of space when guiding a flight through turbulence, and the faces of passengers who never knew how close they had been to disaster. He thought of those moments and compared them to this one, a woman blocking his way as though his life's work meant nothing. The injustice burned, but he let the fire remain hidden for now, waiting for the right moment to unleash it. The murmurs built into voices, and the voices into demands. Passengers pressed call buttons, summoning other crew members. One elderly man leaned out into the aisle, his cane shaking in his hand, as he declared, "Let him through, you are embarrassing." This airline. More heads turned, nodding agreement. A young woman clutching her phone whispered, "This story is going to spread faster than they realized." The stewardess raised her chin, attempting to control the chaos. She spoke loudly, "Enough for all to hear, sir. This is the last warning. If you do not comply, we will have to remove you from the aircraft." Her words dropped like a stone into a stormy sea, and the passengers gasped collectively. The threat of removal for a man who had quietly shown his ticket was too much for many to bear. Marcus finally shifted his stance just slightly, and the cabin went silent, as if the air itself waited. He had not spoken yet, but his movement carried weight. His eyes scanned the passengers, seeing fear, confusion, anger, and hope, all mixed together. He could feel their energy pressing on him, urging him to respond, urging him to prove them right or wrong. The storm had reached its peak, and he was the center of it. The stewardess faltered, her grip on authority weakening as she saw the tide turning. She could not admit she was wrong, not in front of so many eyes. So she pressed on, her voice trembling but determined. "Sir, please move to economy. This is my final request." She reached out her hand as if to gesture him away, but Marcus did not move. His calm became a shield, his silence a sword. He was waiting for something, and though no one knew it yet, he was about to bring the storm to a sudden and shocking end. The passengers leaned forward in unison. Some gripped the armrests tightly, others covered their mouths. All eyes were locked on the man in the aisle and the stewardess in front of him. The rising storm had reached a breaking point, and everyone knew that whatever happened next would be unforgettable. The three words, the air inside the cabin felt heavy, as though everyone had forgotten to breathe. The murmurs that had filled the space only moments ago fell into silence, and in that silence every sound became sharp. The hum of the engines, the click of a seatbelt, the faint rustle of clothing. As passengers leaned forward, no one wanted to miss the moment that was about to unfold. The stewardess stood rigid, her hand half raised, in a futile attempt to block Marcus, her face painted with determination that now trembled at the edges. Marcus looked at her with eyes that held no anger, only a calm certainty that was stronger than any storm for what felt like endless seconds. He remained silent, and the silence itself became unbearable. Passengers shifted in their seats, hearts pounding. With anticipation, they had all been drawn into the drama, but none of them knew the truth. None of them knew who this man really was, or what he carried inside him then. As the pressure reached its breaking point, Marcus opened his mouth and spoke. 3 simple words that sliced through the air like lightning. "I am Pilot." The words were calm and steady, yet they carried more force than a shout. They did not need volume because they held weight deeper than sound. They struck the stewardess first, freezing her in place as if her body no longer obeyed her. Her lips parted, but no reply came. Her face drained of confidence, replaced with disbelief and dawning horror. The passengers gasped, the silence breaking into ripples of shock. Some clapped hands over their mouths, others exchanged stunned glances, and still others leaned closer to see if they had heard correctly. The 3 words echoed through the cabin like thunder rolling over an open field. "I am Pilot." They were not just a claim, they were truth spoken with the authority of a man who had lived it through countless hours, in cockpits through storms and dangers, where his calm had saved lives. They carried a gravity that no one could deny. The stewardess who had doubted him, who had humiliated him in front of all, now stood powerless before the reality of what he had said. Passengers began to speak, one after another, like sparks igniting a blaze. A man in a business suit exclaimed, "You heard him. He is a pilot. Let him sit." A woman holding her child said softly but firmly, "My father was a pilot too." They deserve the highest respect. Do you understand what that means? Others joined in their voices, no longer whispers, but open declarations of support. Their tone carried anger and shame directed at the stewardess who had doubted him. The stewardess stumbled backward, her confidence shattered. She looked down at the ticket in her hand and then back at Marcus, as if hoping it was all a mistake, but deep down she knew it was not. Truth had been spoken, and the truth could not be taken back. Her authority melted under the heat of those 3 words, and the eyes of every passenger now judged her. Instead of Marcus, she tried to compose herself, tried to summon a smile, but her trembling hands betrayed her. She had lost control of the cabin. Marcus remained still, his words lingering in the air. He did not shout, he did not argue, he simply let the truth settle into every mind around him, and as it settled, the atmosphere changed. The passengers who had doubted him lowered their eyes, ashamed. The ones who had believed him earlier now sat taller, vindicated, and the stewardess, the once confident guardian of the aisle, stood like a shadow fading in the presence of the man she had tried to humiliate. Hush swept through the first-class cabin as everyone processed what had just happened. Some passengers whispered again, but this time their words were filled with awe rather than suspicion. "Did you hear what he said? He is a pilot, not just any pilot. Look at how he carries himself. He knew all along that he belonged here." The whispers carried respect, now replacing the earlier doubt, and the energy of the cabin shifted like the sudden calm after thunder. The second stewardess, who had earlier suggested checking with the captain, stepped forward, her face pale with realization. She spoke softly, almost apologetically. "Sir, forgive us. I did not know. I should have trusted my instincts." Her voice trembled, but her sincerity was clear. She looked at her colleague, the one who had started the confrontation, but the other stewardess could not meet her eyes. The cabin became a living witness to a transformation. A man once doubted and humiliated now stood revealed in truth and dignity. A woman who had judged him wrongly now stood exposed before everyone. And the passengers who had taken sides now realized the depth of their error. The 3 words had turned the tide completely. Marcus finally moved, stepping forward. With the same calm confidence he had held from the start, the stewardess instinctively moved aside, no longer able to block him. The aisle cleared, as though the entire cabin bowed silently to the weight of his words. He walked past her with measured steps, his presence commanding without force. His silence now spoke louder than the chaos that had preceded it. He reached his seat, placed his bag overhead, and sat down with a dignity that needed no further defense. The stewardess stood frozen at the front of the cabin, her face red with embarrassment, her hands shaking as she tried to continue greeting passengers, though the boarding was long. Over every time her eyes flicked toward Marcus, she felt the sting of shame. The passengers too looked at her differently now, no longer indifferent, but critical. Their respect had shifted away from her and landed firmly on the man she had tried to belittle. The 3 words continued to echo in every ear. I am pilot. They became more than a statement. They became a lesson, a reminder that worth is not decided by appearance, that dignity cannot be denied, that truth has a way of cutting through prejudice. Like a blade through cloth, the passengers knew they had witnessed something powerful, something they would carry with them long after the plane had landed. The storm had broken, and the truth had been revealed, but the aftermath still lingered. The whispers had changed tone from suspicion to respect, but the weight of the confrontation still hung in the air. Marcus leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but as a quiet act of reclaiming his space. The cabin crew scrambled to compose themselves, but the shift in power was undeniable. The man they had tried to push aside had become the silent center of respect and authority, and though Marcus had spoken only 3 words, the entire cabin felt as though a book had been opened before them, a book that told of long journeys, struggles endured, and victories earned. His 3 words were the key that unlocked the truth for everyone who had dared to doubt. The rising storm had broken with thunder, but what came next would be the revelation that shook them all. Shock and revelation. The 3 words still echoed in the cabin. I am pilot. The passengers had gone silent again, but this silence was not like before. It was no longer the uneasy silence of doubt. It was the heavy silence of realization. Every heart beat a little faster, every mind turned over the meaning of those words, and every pair of eyes now saw Marcus in a different light. The stewardess who had challenged him stood pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if holding onto the last fragments of authority. Her face revealed what her mouth would not admit. She knew she had crossed a line she should never have crossed. The man in the business suit who had earlier defended Marcus leaned back in his seat with a satisfied nod, as if his faith had been rewarded. He whispered to the woman beside him, I told you. I could see it in his eyes. That is a man who has faced storms and carried lives in his hands, not someone sneaking into a seat. He does not deserve. The woman smiled faintly, but her eyes were locked on Marcus with awe. Not mockery anymore, but admiration. A young student with her phone still raised whispered to her friend, I cannot believe this. We just saw history unfold right here. Her friend shook her head, stunned. This is bigger than a video. This is a lesson. Look at how everyone feels now. The phone lowered slowly as she realized some moments are too sacred to be captured on a screen. They are meant to be carried in the heart. The stewardess tried to gather herself. She stepped toward Marcus, her voice trembling with forced politeness. Sir, if you would like anything during this flight, please let us know. Her words lacked the authority she had wielded earlier. They sounded like surrender. Marcus did not reply. He simply inclined his head, a fraction, his calm demeanor cutting deeper than any harsh word could have. The stewardess felt the sting of that silence sharper than the sting of his words. She knew she had lost the respect of everyone in that cabin. Passengers exchanged stories of their own now. Some whispered about their fathers or brothers who had served as pilots or soldiers, men who had been doubted and underestimated until the truth came out. Their words carried solidarity with Marcus. They felt connected to his quiet strength. A mother whispered to her child who kept staring, do you see that man? He just taught us all a lesson. Always remember that respect is not about appearances. The child nodded, eyes wide, soaking in the lesson. The second stewardess approached Marcus quietly with genuine humility. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. Sir, I am truly sorry for the way this unfolded. I should have stepped in earlier. I could see you carried yourself differently. I will not forget this. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her with the same calm expression. He did not reply with words, but the way he held her gaze conveyed forgiveness and understanding. The stewardess bowed her head, grateful though ashamed for not having acted sooner. The revelation of his identity spread like a wave through the entire aircraft. Passengers in economy who had overheard the words through the thin divider leaned forward, asking others what had happened. Soon everyone knew the man who had been humiliated at the door of first class was in fact a pilot himself, someone who had earned the very respect denied to him. The weight of the truth pressed down on those who had judged him harshly earlier. They could not meet his eyes now. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, embarrassed by their own whispers. The businessman in row 3 raised his voice loud enough for the cabin to hear. This airline should be honored to have a man like him flying their planes. We all know it takes courage, skill, and years of sacrifice to earn those wings. Shame on anyone who doubted him. His declaration brought a murmur of agreement from many passengers. A few even clapped softly, the sound awkward at first, but soon spreading until applause filled the cabin. The stewardess who had caused the humiliation froze, her face flushing red with shame. The applause was not for her, it was for the man she had tried to belittle. Marcus did not bask in it. He simply nodded once, then sat still, his composure unshaken. He did not need the applause, because dignity was already his, but for the passengers. It was their way of apologizing, their way of acknowledging the wrong and honoring the truth. The applause faded into silence again, but this time it was a respectful silence, filled with awe. The stewardess finally retreated to the galley, her hands trembling as she poured water into cups. She could not bear the eyes upon her. She replayed her words in her mind, premium passengers reserved for others. Not you. Each phrase now stabbed her conscience. She had been so sure, so proud of her judgment, and now it crumbled beneath her. She had thought herself the authority, but she had faced a man whose very presence commanded more respect than her title ever could. Marcus sat still, but his mind traveled through memories of his years in the cockpit. He remembered nights flying through storms where lightning danced outside the windows, and passengers slept unaware of how close danger had brushed them. He remembered moments when engines faltered, and he held the crew steady, guiding them home. He remembered standing tall during training, when others doubted his ability because of his skin, and he remembered proving them wrong time and time again. Those memories gave weight to the 3 words he had spoken. They were not mere words, they were the truth of a life lived with discipline and sacrifice. The revelation did more than silence the stewardess. It touched the passengers deeply, because it revealed a story they had not expected. They had boarded, thinking it was just another flight. But now they had been pulled into a lesson about dignity, respect, and truth. Some sat reflecting on their own biases, ashamed at how quickly they had judged others, sat inspired by Marcus's calm strength, vowing to carry that lesson into their own lives. The cabin was no longer just a collection of strangers, it had become a shared witness to something larger. The second stewardess returned with water, offering it to Marcus. He accepted politely, and she whispered, "Again, thank you for showing us what dignity looks like." He took a sip, then set the cup down quietly, not needing to speak further. His silence was its own sermon. The revelation continued to ripple outward. The passengers whispered less now, but when they did, their words carried reverence. Did you see how calm he was? He did not raise his voice once. That is true strength. He is a pilot. Imagine the responsibility he carries with lives in his hands, and yet he let her doubt him until he chose to reveal it. That takes more control than most of us could ever show. The admiration grew until even those who had doubted him earlier found themselves respecting him. The stewardess, who had insulted him, finally returned to the aisle, her face set but her eyes unable to meet his. She went through the motions of checking seatbelts and closing overhead bins, but every step felt heavy. Every passenger she passed looked at her differently, and she felt the weight of their judgment. She had become the villain in a story she could not erase, and the truth of it burned. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused for a moment, as though about to speak an apology, but no words came. She moved on quickly, unable to face him. She would carry the shame for the rest of that flight, and perhaps longer. The revelation had stripped away her pride, and left her with nothing but regret. Captain's voice finally came over the intercom, announcing the departure. The sound jolted the cabin back into routine, but beneath the normality, the memory of what had just unfolded remained etched into every heart. The revelation had changed the atmosphere forever. Marcus sat quietly listening to the voice of his colleague, the captain, guiding the passengers with calm assurance. He knew that voice. He knew the weight of responsibility it carried, and he respected it deeply. Yet he also knew the passengers now respected him as well. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the stewardess busied herself with duties, but inside she knew the passengers no longer saw her as the face of authority. They saw her as a lesson in judgment gone wrong. And Marcus, though sitting quietly, was now the symbol of dignity in the cabin. The revelation had shifted the balance completely, and everyone knew it. The storm of Part 3 had broken with thunder in Part 4, and now in Part 5 the revelation left the cabin shaken, humbled, and changed forever. Justice in the sky. The engines roared as the plane rolled across the runway and lifted into the evening sky, but inside the cabin, the weight of what had happened still lingered. The revelation of Marcus's identity had shifted the air forever. Passengers who had once looked at him with suspicion now looked with respect, some even with quiet reverence. The stewardess who had caused the insult went about her duties, but each movement carried shame. She could feel the eyes upon her, each one a reminder of her mistake. She avoided Marcus's gaze, but his silence followed her like a shadow. Marcus sat in his seat, calm and steady, gazing out the window as the earth fell away beneath them. Clouds Drifted by glowing orange in the setting sun, he thought of the countless times he had looked down from this very height. From the cockpit with his hands on the controls, he remembered flights through thunder and lightning, where fear hung in the air, yet he had kept his voice steady, guiding crew and passengers through the storm. He remembered the responsibility of every life strapped into their seatbelts, and he compared it to this moment, a moment where his only task was to endure an insult. With dignity, his lips curved faintly in a smile, not of joy but of quiet victory. In the rows behind him, passengers leaned close, whispering not with suspicion now but with admiration. One man whispered to his wife that stewardess will never forget what happened today. He carried himself with more authority than any uniform could show. Another whispered to his daughter, "Do you see how he stayed calm even when humiliated? That is the strength of a true leader." The daughter nodded, her eyes wide, as she tucked a moment into her memory, knowing it would shape how she saw the world. The stewardess finally approached Marcus, unable to escape the duty that required her to serve first class. She held a tray in trembling hands, offering drinks. Her voice was low, her tone no longer sharp, but subdued. "Sir, would you like anything?" She hoped for forgiveness, but Marcus only gave a slight nod and accepted water. He did not need to speak, because his silence still carried more weight than her words. Her cheeks flushed as she moved on, and she knew she would replay that silence for the rest of her life. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We are cruising at 35,000 feet and will be arriving on time. Please sit back and enjoy your flight." His voice reminded Marcus of countless announcements he had made himself. His chest swelled slightly with pride, not for the authority of the words, but for the brotherhood of those who carried the responsibility of guiding lives through the sky. He thought of the unseen work that pilots gave day after day, while passengers slept unaware, and he smiled again, knowing the passengers around him now understood a small part of that wait. Hours passed, but the memory of the confrontation never left the cabin. It was as if the passengers carried a shared secret, binding them together. They looked at Marcus not just as another traveler, but as a symbol of quiet justice, of truth revealed at the right time. Some nodded to him when passing, others gave faint respectful smiles. He did not seek their acknowledgement, but he accepted it as part of the journey. The stewardess who had insulted him remained restless. She moved through the cabin, but her thoughts circled back to that moment. Every time 3 words had undone her pride and revealed the smallness of her judgment, she wished she could turn back time and greet him with respect, but time cannot be undone. She avoided his gaze, yet every time she glimpsed him sitting tall and calm, she felt the weight of her mistake heavier than before. She understood that respect is not something given to uniforms or appearances. It is earned by character, and she had failed to see it until it was too late. Marcus leaned back, letting the hum of the engines wash over him. He thought of his journey not just as a pilot, but as a man who had been doubted, underestimated and tested countless times. He knew prejudice would always exist, but he also knew dignity would always be stronger. He had learned long ago that silence often speaks louder than anger, and truth spoken at the right moment carries more power than any argument. His 3 words had been enough. They had silenced doubt and turned judgment into respect. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to rest in the victory of quiet justice. As the hours passed, the plane began its descent. The captain announced their approach, and the passengers prepared for landing, but none of them would leave that plane the same way they had entered. They had seen a man humiliated, and they had seen him rise without rage, without shouting, simply with truth and dignity. They had witnessed prejudice crumble and respect take its place, and each of them carried that memory as a quiet lesson. The stewardess stood at the front of the cabin, her face pale, as the plane touched down. The wheels hit the runway with a rumble, and the engines slowed. Passengers applauded as they often did at the end of flights, but beneath the applause there was another layer of meaning. This time the applause carried respect, not just for the safe landing, but for the man who had endured humiliation and turned it into a moment of justice. As the plane taxied to the gate, Marcus rose from his seat, calm as ever. He pulled his bag from the overhead bin with steady hands and turned toward the aisle. Passengers stepped aside, not out of fear but out of respect. A few murmured thank you as he passed. Though he had done nothing for them directly, they felt he had given them something more valuable than service. He had given them a lesson in dignity. The stewardess stood by the door, forced by duty to say goodbye to every passenger. Her heart pounded as Marcus approached. She wanted to speak to her, apologize, to beg forgiveness, but when his eyes met hers, she froze. His gaze was calm, not harsh, but it carried the weight of truth. She opened her mouth, but words failed. Marcus simply gave a faint nod as he stepped past her, leaving her with the silence of her own regret. She knew she would never forget that moment Marcus stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air rushing around him, the hum of the airport returned, the chatter of passengers collecting bags, the calls of flight attendants preparing for the next boarding. But inside Marcus there was calm. He had faced another storm, and once again he had come through with dignity intact. He walked down the long bridge, his footsteps steady, his head held high. Behind him the passengers carried whispers that would spread beyond that plane, stories of the man who spoke 3 words and silenced a cabin. Stories that would travel far wider than he would ever know. For Marcus, it was not about fame or recognition. It was about standing firm in truth, about refusing to bow to humiliation, about showing that dignity cannot be denied. His silence had been his shield, his words had been his sword, and in the end, justice had been his companion in the sky. The story of that flight would live on in the memories of all who were there. A child would remember the calm, strong man who taught her father to whisper about respect. A young student would tell her friends about the 3 words that changed a plane. A businessman would repeat the tale in offices as proof that prejudice has no place in dignity, and the stewardess would carry her shame as a lifelong reminder of the cost of judgment. Marcus walked out into the terminal, blending with the crowd, yet carrying with him the quiet strength of a man who had spoken truth and taught a lesson without raising his voice. He knew there would always be storms ahead, but he also knew that storms, no matter how fierce, always passed, and dignity always endured. The journey of that flight had ended, but the lesson would fly far beyond it, carried by every witness who had been there, and by every heart that heard. The story of 3 words spoken in the face of insult, 3 words that left an entire crew speechless, 3 words that proved justice could soar in the sky. The end.